There's a question that almost nobody studying ancient texts wants to answer out loud because the answer is too inconvenient for both sides of the argument. For decades, scholars insisted the Bible was rewritten so many times that the original words were lost forever. And for decades, believers had no way to prove them wrong. Then the ground itself started talking. Caves opened, cities buried under salt and sand were dragged back into daylight, stones with names carved into them surfaced in places no one expected, and slowly a pattern emerged that neither side saw coming. This is not a story about faith. This is a story about evidence, about 14 real places on this planet that were supposed to be myth, legend, or poetic exaggeration, and are not. Stay with this, because by the end you will understand why one of the most famous proofs of the Bible was quietly pulled apart by science itself in 2025, and why that retraction might be more revealing than the original discovery ever was. For most of modern history, the official position of biblical scholarship was simple and devastating. The oldest manuscripts we had access to dated to roughly 1,000 years after Christ. That left a black hole of over a millennium, a window during which critics argued the text could have been edited, softened, exaggerated, or quietly rewritten to fit whatever theology was convenient at the time. There was no way to check, no way to compare. The original words, if they had ever existed in a pure form, were assumed gone. And then, in 1947, in the limestone cliffs above the Dead Sea, a teenage shepherd looking for a missing goat threw a rock into a dark opening in the rock and heard something that should not have been there. Pottery, breaking pottery, deep inside a cave that had no business holding anything man-made. What he found inside changed the entire conversation, and almost nobody outside academic circles understood how big it really was. Inside those clay jars were scrolls, wrapped and sealed, untouched for roughly 2,000 years. They were the work of the Essenes, a reclusive Jewish sect obsessed with ritual purity who had devoted their lives to copying scripture with an almost unbearable precision. As Roman legions closed in on Jerusalem in 68 AD, this community made a decision that would echo for 2 millennia. Rather than let their life's work be destroyed, they sealed it inside the driest, most chemically hostile environment on the planet and walked away. The Dead Sea's brutal climate, its salt, its near-total absence of moisture, became an accidental vault. Over the following decades, archaeologists combed the surrounding cliffs and eventually pulled more than 900 scrolls and over 50,000 fragments from 11 separate caves. Among them were copies of nearly every book of what we now call the Old Testament. And here is where the real shockwave hit. When researchers laid these ancient texts beside the modern Hebrew Bible, line by line, word by word, they found something that should have been impossible if the critics were right. The text had not drifted. The great Isaiah scroll alone, over 7 meters long and 1,000 years older than any previous copy known to exist, matched the modern version with roughly 95% precision, the remaining differences being nothing more than spelling variations that changed not a single meaning. Read that again. 1,000 years of supposed corruption, and the text barely moved at all. But Qumran was not finished delivering shocks. Among the hundreds of scrolls recovered from those caves, one stood completely apart from the rest, and it had nothing to do with Scripture. In 1952, inside a cave, numbered simply as 3, researchers uncovered a scroll unlike anything found before or since. It was not made of parchment, it was made of nearly pure copper, a material so impractical for writing that its very existence raised immediate suspicion. The copper had corroded so badly over the centuries that unrolling it would have caused it to crumble into dust. So it was shipped to a laboratory in Manchester, where technicians used surgical precision saws to cut it into 23 separate strips just to read what was inscribed inside. What they found was not theology. It was the largest unsolved treasure inventory in human history. A list of 64 locations describing tons of gold, tons of silver, sacred garments, and ritual incense, all hidden away before the Romans arrived to destroy the temple in Jerusalem. Scholars widely believe this was the actual inventory of the Second Temple's treasury, hastily concealed by priests who expected to return for it once the danger passed. They never did. To this day, that fortune, by some estimates worth an almost unthinkable sum in modern currency, has never been recovered. The landscape has changed beyond recognition. Ancient landmarks like riverbeds and specific wells have eroded into meaninglessness. Some researchers suspect the inscriptions deliberately use a private code, a kind of internal shorthand only the priesthood would have understood. Others believe the Romans tortured the locations out of survivors centuries ago, and the treasure was already gone before anyone thought to look. The copper scroll sits today in a museum in Amman, Jordan, still being studied, still defying every attempt to fully decode it. As recently as 2017, an additional cave, numbered 12, was uncovered nearby, and for a moment the world held its breath. What they found inside was nothing but shattered jars, empty, looted long before modern eyes ever saw them. The treasure remains exactly where it has always been, hidden. Just beside those caves lies a body of water that defies basic physics. The Dead Sea sits more than 400 meters below sea level, the lowest exposed point on the surface of the Earth, and its salt concentration is nearly 10 times that of the open ocean. Lie back in it, and you do not sink, you float, suspended, as if the rules governing every other body of water on the planet simply do not apply here. Today, it is a wasteland. No fish, no algae, nothing living survives in it. But the Bible insists that 4,000 years ago, this exact region was the opposite of barren. It describes a lush, fertile basin, a tropical paradise sustaining 5 wealthy cities, among them 2 names that have become permanent shorthand for moral collapse, Sodom and Gomorrah. According to the ancient account, the corruption in these cities grew so extreme that judgment fell from the sky itself, fire and sulfur descending in an instant, flattening everything, leaving the entire plain in permanent ruin. For generations, this was treated as theological exaggeration, a morality tale dressed up as history. Then, in 2021, a team of researchers working at a site called Tal El Hammam, just northeast of the Dead Sea, published findings that exploded across global media. They had uncovered a thick layer of ash, melted bricks, and pottery that had been turned into glass, a transformation that requires temperatures well above 2,000 degrees Celsius, hotter than most volcanic eruptions on record. Their conclusion was staggering. A cosmic airburst, possibly a meteor or a fragmenting comet exploding in the atmosphere, had detonated above the city roughly 3,600 years ago, with a force researchers compared to a nuclear weapon, vaporizing the settlement within seconds, and even, according to the original study, flash evaporating water from the Dead Sea into a rain of scalding salt. Headlines around the world declared it the scientific confirmation of Sodom and Gomorrah. It fit the ancient description with eerie precision. Fire from the sky, a landscape turned to ash, a wife of Lot turned to a pillar of salt while looking back at the destruction. But here is where it gets complicated, and this is the part almost nobody outside specialist circles has heard. In April of 2025, the scientific journal that originally published this research formally retracted the entire study. Independent geologists and physicists had spent years picking apart the data, and their conclusion was damning. The mineralogical evidence had been misread. The comparison to the famous Tunguska explosion in Siberia, which had been central to the original argument, was built on flawed assumptions about temperature, wind force, and blast radius. The editors stated plainly that they no longer had confidence the paper's conclusions were reliable. Think about what that means. One of the most viral, most widely repeated proofs connecting modern archaeology to biblical catastrophe was quietly dismantled by the same scientific process that created it, and almost no one heard about the correction with anywhere near the volume of the original announcement. This does not mean Tal El Hammam was never destroyed, nor does it prove or disprove its connection to Sodom and Gomorrah, a link that remains genuinely disputed among archaeologists regardless of the meteor theory. What it proves is something far more uncomfortable for anyone chasing easy answers. The truth about these ancient ruins is still being fought over in real time in academic journals by people who have devoted entire careers to getting it right. And the story is not finished. It may never be finished. The mystery of what really happened on that ancient plain remains exactly that. A mystery. From the edge of that scorched basin, the trail moves toward water that represents the opposite of destruction. A narrow, muddy, unglamorous river that nonetheless marks one of the most significant borders in religious history. Then, geological records revealed something unsettling. The Jordan Valley sits on an active seismic fault line, and earthquake-triggered landslides have repeatedly dammed the river's flow throughout documented history, at least 6 separate times. As recently as 1927, one such collapse blocked the river's course for 21 consecutive hours, leaving the bed completely dry. The same physical phenomenon described in an ancient religious text turned out to be a recurring, measurable geological event. Decades later, this same river became the setting for one of the most consequential moments in religious history, the baptism of Jesus. For centuries, the exact location remained disputed, until a mosaic map preserved in a Jordanian church pointed researchers toward a specific stretch of riverbank. Excavations conducted in the 1990s, made possible only after regional peace accords finally allowed access, uncovered the remains of 5 separate Byzantine-era churches built directly on the water's edge, along with a marble structure carved with descending steps, a baptismal pool shaped unmistakably like a cross. Nearby, Roman roads and administrative ruins confirmed something easy to overlook. Crossing this river in antiquity meant crossing an actual political and legal boundary, not just a geographic one. And today, that same river is dying. Diversion for agriculture and human consumption has reduced its flow by roughly 95%. In some stretches, it has become little more than a trickle. Because the Dead Sea depends entirely on this water source, the slow death of the Jordan is, quite literally, the slow death of the Dead Sea as well. Two biblical landmarks, bound together in decline, vanishing in real time while almost no one outside the region pays attention. Just a short distance from that riverbank, the ancient account describes the first encampment of the Israelites after finally crossing into their promised territory, a place called Gilgal. For decades, archaeologists searched for an ordinary fortified settlement and found nothing because they were looking for the wrong kind of structure entirely. It took an archaeologist willing to look from above, scanning aerial photography, rather than digging blindly, to spot something extraordinary. 5 massive stone formations, some larger than several soccer fields combined, arranged unmistakably in the shape of giant human footprints. The ancient text repeatedly uses a specific phrase to describe the promise made to this wandering people, that every place the sole of your foot treads would belong to them, a legal formula in which the act of physically standing on land constituted a literal claim of ownership. These footprint-shaped enclosures were not homes. They were ceremonial structures, walking paths built so worshippers could physically trace the outline of a footprint as a ritual reminder that the ground beneath them now had an owner. It is one of the strangest, most literal pieces of evidence connecting ancient religious language to physical architecture anywhere in this entire investigation, and it is still visible from the sky today. From that camp, the ancient Israelites would have looked up and seen their greatest obstacle waiting on the horizon, the fortified city of Jericho, frequently cited as the oldest continuously inhabited settlement on Earth, sitting nearly 250 meters below sea level. Excavations at the site have revealed more than 20 distinct layers of occupation, some over 10,000 years old, meaning that by the time this particular conquest narrative takes place, Jericho had already outlasted entire civilizations. According to the ancient account, the city fell not through siege warfare, but through a bizarre ritual procession, days of silent marching circling the walls, followed by a final shout that brought the fortifications crashing down in a way that created an instant ramp of rubble for attackers to climb. For decades, leading archaeologists, including the influential excavator Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s, argued there were no walls standing at all during the relevant historical period, effectively closing the case on the story as fiction. But later excavations revealed something that reopened the entire debate. At the base of the city's stone fortifications, archaeologists found a substantial mound of collapsed mud brick that had fallen outward, away from the city, forming exactly the kind of debris ramp the ancient account describes. A collapse pattern consistent with sudden seismic activity rather than gradual decay. Beneath the rubble, investigators found a thick layer of ash and charred grain, evidence of an intense, short-lived fire severe enough to bake the mud brick walls as hard as kiln-fired pottery. And critically, the grain jars were found full, untouched, never looted, a detail that fits an account in which the attacking force was specifically instructed not to take spoils from the conquered city. None of this proves every supernatural element of the narrative, but it confirms something specific and measurable, a real city, real walls, a short, intense siege, a fire, and an outward collapse that should not exist if the skeptics describing an empty hilltop had been entirely correct. From the lowest point on the map, the journey climbs toward the place that has dominated more human bloodshed than perhaps any city in recorded history, a city whose very name translates to peace, and which has, with brutal irony, witnessed almost none of it. Jerusalem has been besieged, conquered, and rebuilt more than 40 times, erased from existence entirely on at least 2 separate occasions, and somehow always returns. Its founding story begins with a king who had just unified a fractured nation and desperately needed a capital that belonged to no single tribe, a neutral location no faction could claim as their own birthright. He found his answer in a small, supposedly impenetrable fortress whose defenders mocked the very idea of conquest. What those defenders did not account for was a vulnerability hiding in plain sight, the city's single water source, accessed through a hidden vertical shaft connected to a natural spring outside the walls. A small group of soldiers exploited that hidden access point, and by morning the fortress had a new owner and a new name. From that moment forward, this city became something far larger than a political headquarters. It became the intended permanent home of the most sacred object in the entire religious tradition, the Ark of the Covenant, and eventually the site of a temple so architecturally ambitious that the ancient account claims it took over 180,000 laborers 7 years to complete, with stones deliberately cut off-site so that no sound of construction tools would desecrate the sacred ground itself. For nearly 4 centuries, this temple stood as the unquestioned center of national and religious identity, until 586 BC, when the Babylonian army under Nebuchadnezzar surrounded the city, starved it into submission, and burned the temple to ash. The ancient record meticulously lists every treasure the Babylonians carried away as plunder, gold vessels, ceremonial columns, sacred altars. And then comes the detail that has fueled centuries of speculation. The single most important object in the entire religious tradition, the Ark itself, is conspicuously absent from that list, Not stolen, not destroyed. Simply missing, as though the historical record itself were structured to leave a deliberate, unanswered question hanging in the air. Where did it go? Theories range from secret removal before the siege began, to concealment somewhere within the labyrinth of tunnels beneath the city, to outright destruction so total it left no trace to record. No one knows. No one has ever produced it. And in a city where excavation teams routinely uncover first-century structures by accident, this absence remains one of archaeology's most stubborn open wounds. The city itself refused to stay buried. Exiles eventually returned and rebuilt a second, humbler temple, later expanded by Herod the Great into one of the most lavish structures the ancient world had ever seen. A building so visually overwhelming that a famous warning was reportedly issued about it by a wandering teacher from Galilee who predicted that not one stone of it would remain standing on another. At the time, this sounded almost absurd given the scale of the construction, some individual stones weighing hundreds of tons. Less than 40 years later, Roman legions crushed a Jewish revolt, set the temple ablaze, and, in their determination to recover the gold that had melted into the cracks between the stones during the fire, dismantled the entire structure piece by piece. The prophecy, intentionally or not, came true with brutal literalism. What remained standing afterward was never actually part of the temple itself, despite centuries of popular belief. The western wall, known to many as the Wailing Wall, is in fact a retaining structure, part of the massive foundation platform Herod built to support the temple above it, not the temple's own walls. And astonishingly, the section visible to visitors today, roughly 57 meters of exposed stone, represents only about 15% of its actual total length, the remainder buried beneath the layered, labyrinthine modern city above it. In 2004, a maintenance crew repairing a water pipe accidentally cracked open the ground and exposed first-century stone steps belonging to what turned out to be the Pool of Siloam, a site directly referenced in religious accounts of healing. Its authenticity confirmed almost immediately by coins, inscriptions, and seals dating precisely to the period in question. Jerusalem, more than any other location in this entire investigation, behaves less like an archaeological site and more like a city built on stacked layers of unresolved history, each one waiting for the next accidental discovery to drag it back into the light. A short distance south, the trail leads to the small town where, according to tradition, that long royal line ultimately produced its most consequential descendant. Bethlehem sits atop a network of natural caves that have served as shelter and stable for thousands of years. And inside one specific cave, an ancient pagan emperor unintentionally preserved the precise location of the birth he was trying to erase. By constructing a temple to a foreign god directly over the site, that emperor inadvertently marked it for future generations, because when Christianity later became the dominant religion of the empire, locating the original site required nothing more than locating his temple and tearing it down. Beneath it, intact, sat the original grotto, over which a basilica was constructed, rebuilt after fire damage, and which still functions today as one of the oldest continuously operating churches anywhere on the planet. To enter it, visitors must pass through a deliberately low, narrow doorway built centuries ago specifically to force everyone, regardless of rank or status, to physically stoop to get inside, an architectural statement that needs no further explanation. Deep within, a silver star embedded in marble marks the traditional spot of the manger itself, worn smooth by the touch of countless hands across centuries. But step back outside that sacred interior, and the contrast becomes almost unbearable. To enter modern Bethlehem today, visitors must pass through a concrete barrier roughly 8 meters tall, built following a wave of violent unrest decades ago and now functioning as a hard physical boundary between this town and the surrounding region, cutting off much of its economic opportunity in the process. The human cost of that isolation has been severe and is accelerating. In 1947, Christians made up roughly 85% of Bethlehem's population. Today, that number has collapsed to somewhere around 10%, and it continues shrinking. The birthplace of an entire religious tradition is steadily losing the very community that has guarded its holiest sites for 2,000 years. And this is not an isolated phenomenon confined to one town. It is happening across the wider region, quietly, with almost no global attention, and it raises an uncomfortable question that has nothing to do with ancient archaeology at all. What happens to sacred history when the people who have protected it for 2 millennia simply are no longer there to do it? A journey further north leads to the unremarkable hillside village where that same historical figure grew up, a place so insignificant in its own time that being identified by it was considered at best unremarkable and at worst an insult. Nazareth was nothing more than a small cluster of stone homes clinging to a hillside, yet it sat barely a few miles from a major international trade route connecting entire empires, meaning the town's isolation was deliberate camouflage rather than true seclusion, hidden from casual notice while still within constant reach of the wider world passing by. Today, the largest Christian church in the entire region stands above the traditional site where an angelic announcement is said to have occurred, but the more compelling evidence sits beneath ordinary ground nearby. A convent courtyard excavation accidentally uncovered ancient walls and a structure carved directly into limestone bedrock. Initial academic interest was minimal until a British archaeologist re-examined the site in 2004 and identified construction techniques consistent with skilled first-century stonemasonry, the kind of specialized craftsmanship associated specifically with a master builder rather than a casual laborer. Whether this specific structure was the actual childhood home of that historical figure remains genuinely disputed among scholars. And it is important to be honest about that uncertainty rather than presenting speculation as settled fact. What is verifiable is that Byzantine Christians later built a dedicated church directly over this exact structure, suggesting that, whatever the full truth, ancient communities living far closer to the relevant timeline believed the location mattered enough to physically protect. From this quiet inland village, the trail moves toward the coast, toward a city built entirely from political ambition and engineered to dazzle an empire that had never seen anything like it. Caesarea Maritima did not exist naturally. It was constructed from nothing along a coastline with no natural harbor, requiring colossal artificial breakwaters extending into open water to create a calm artificial bay where ships could finally anchor safely. Around that engineering marvel rose palaces, a massive amphitheater, and marble avenues designed specifically to project Roman-aligned power, a factor reinforced by the city's deliberate naming in honor of the reigning emperor. In 1961, archaeologists working at the site's ancient theater uncovered a limestone block that had been casually repurposed as a staircase step centuries earlier. Cleaning revealed a Latin inscription naming a specific Roman governor of the province, a name that, until that exact moment, existed only inside religious texts with zero independent historical confirmation outside them. The single block, now known as the Pilate Stone, remains one of the most significant pieces of physical evidence connecting a religious narrative to verified, datable, real-world political history. It proves, beyond meaningful dispute, that a specific governor existed and held exactly the authority the ancient accounts claim he held at exactly the time they claim it. This same city later became the site of a pivotal religious shift, the first recorded inclusion of a non-Jewish convert into the early Christian movement, an event that effectively transformed a regional religious sect into a message intended for the entire known world. Years afterward, the same city held a different prisoner under guard for roughly 2 years, a man who would eventually invoke his legal right as a Roman citizen to demand trial in Rome itself, a journey that ended in his execution while simultaneously planting the seeds of an entirely new chapter of religious expansion across the empire. And now, the city that once defied the sea has lost that fight permanently. Earthquakes, shifting fault lines, and centuries of gradual erosion eventually pulled the entire harbor underwater. Divers exploring the site today move through fallen columns, coral-covered anchors, and intact Roman concrete blocks scattered across the seafloor, an entire vanished metropolis lying quietly beneath the waves, visible only to those willing to go looking for it. Following that same ancient trade corridor inland brings the story to a modest fishing village on the shore of an inland lake. At a place explicitly described in ancient texts as a primary base of operations for an itinerant teacher's ministry. For a long time, this location existed only as a name on a map, with no physical confirmation behind it, until 19th century excavations revealed a first century settlement built entirely from local black basalt stone, complete with a synagogue, constructed directly atop an earlier place of worship, dating to precisely the relevant historical period. Just a short walk away, excavators uncovered something even more unusual. An ordinary domestic house that had clearly stopped functioning as a private residence at some point had been converted into a communal gathering space, its walls covered in layered inscriptions written in multiple ancient languages, invoking a specific name with clear religious reverence. Early Christian communities later built increasingly elaborate structures directly over this house, eventually capping it with an octagonal church, a level of architectural investment that strongly suggests this specific location carried serious significance to people living far closer to the original events than we are today. And yet, despite this apparent importance, the ancient text itself contains what amounts to a direct warning about this town's eventual fate, a prediction of total decline rather than enduring prominence. History appears to have honored that warning with brutal indifference. The settlement was never destroyed by conquest or catastrophe. It simply faded, abandoned gradually over the following centuries, until it stopped existing as a functioning city altogether, leaving only quiet ruins along a lakeshore that once buzzed with merchants, soldiers, and crowds. Stepping back even further into deep antiquity, the trail moves into one of the harshest, most unforgiving landscapes on the planet, toward a mountain whose exact location remains, even now, a genuinely unresolved scholarly mystery. According to ancient tradition, this mountain was the setting for one of the most consequential events in the entire religious narrative, a direct encounter resulting in a foundational legal and moral code carved into stone. And yet, despite the scale of the event being described, no definitive marker was ever left behind identifying precisely where it occurred. Multiple candidate locations exist, separated by national borders and centuries of competing tradition, and to this day, no single site commands universal scholarly agreement. At the base of one of the most widely accepted candidate sites sits a monastery considered the oldest continuously operating Christian monastic community in the world, protected for over a millennium, in part by a tradition claiming it received an early guarantee of protection from a major regional religious authority entirely outside its own faith. Inside its walls rests one of the most significant manuscript collections on the planet, second in importance, only to the Vatican's own archives, including one of the oldest known complete copies of the Christian scriptures in existence. And growing within the monastery grounds is a specific shrub that monks have maintained for generations, is a direct botanical descendant of a miraculous burning plant central to the mountain's founding story. A species so rare that every documented attempt to transplant a cutting elsewhere has failed completely. Whatever the full truth of its exact geography, this mountain and its surrounding landscape have been treated as sacred ground for longer than most modern nations have existed. From there, the journey crosses into territory even older than the foundational stories of this entire religious tradition, toward the banks of a river in modern-day Iraq, toward a city whose name has become permanent shorthand for human arrogance and inevitable collapse. Babylon was, in its prime, among the largest, wealthiest, and most architecturally ambitious cities the ancient world had ever produced, ruled at its peak by a king whose military campaigns directly intersected with the destruction of Jerusalem's first temple and the forced exile of its population. For a long time, descriptions of Babylon's scale, walls supposedly wide enough for two chariots to pass each other along their tops, sounded like obvious historical exaggeration. Then archaeologists actually got there. The Ishtar Gate, a massive entrance covered in glazed blue brick and decorated with relief carvings of mythological creatures, was uncovered largely intact, and embedded throughout its foundation were thousands of bricks, individually stamped with an inscription naming the very same king directly responsible for Jerusalem's destruction. This was not circumstantial evidence. This was the conqueror's own signature, embedded in the literal foundation of his capital. According to historical accounts, this empire's downfall came almost overnight, a besieging army diverting a river's course to slip beneath the city's defenses while its population celebrated unaware. In 1879, archaeologists recovered direct physical confirmation of the aftermath, a clay artifact known today as the Cyrus Cylinder, now housed in the British Museum, on which the conquering king explicitly grants captured populations permission to return home and rebuild their own religious sites, a policy decision that lines up precisely with later accounts describing the exiled population's eventual return to rebuild their temple. But Babylon's story stretches back even further than its imperial peak, all the way to a much older account describing humanity's first attempt to build a tower reaching toward the heavens, an act of collective ambition that, according to the ancient narrative, was deliberately disrupted. For centuries, this was treated as pure allegory until archaeologists identified the remains of a massive stepped structure at the site, a colossal multi-tiered pyramid roughly 90 meters on each side and rising to a comparable height, constructed using kiln-fired brick bound with bitumen, a specific combination of building materials the ancient text describes with surprising technical accuracy. A black stone inscription discovered at the site contains an unmistakable royal boast, a king claiming credit for gathering laborers from every nation and language to complete a structure intended to rival the sky itself, language that echoes the original narrative's themes with uncomfortable precision. Even more remarkable, that same king's inscription openly admits he did not originate the project, describing instead an already ancient, long-ruined structure that previous rulers had abandoned centuries earlier, a detail suggesting the tower's legendary status predated even this empire's own historical records. Centuries later, Alexander the Great, encountering the same ruins during his conquest of the region, reportedly attempted to rebuild the structure using its own recycled materials, deploying thousands of soldiers to clear the site, only to die suddenly before laying a single new brick, leaving the project permanently abandoned. And in the wider region surrounding these ruins, archaeologists uncovered something that has quietly unsettled skeptics for over a century: ancient clay tablets recording a list of regional kings whose reigns are explicitly divided into two distinct historical eras, separated by a single catastrophic, civilization-altering flood. Before that flood, the recorded reigns stretch into implausibly long spans of time. After it, those numbers collapse dramatically into far more ordinary, human-scale lengths. This independent, non-religious historical record describing extreme pre-flood lifespans, followed by a sudden drop afterward, bears an undeniable structural resemblance to similar patterns found in the earliest chapters of Genesis. And whatever conclusion one draws from that resemblance, its mere existence as an independent corroborating data point is difficult to dismiss outright. The final stop on this entire journey sits in northern Israel, on a strategic hill overlooking a valley that has hosted more military conflict than almost any comparable location on the planet. Tel Megiddo is not a single ancient city. It is a vertical stack of more than 24 separate civilizations, each one rising on the rubble of the one before it, because whoever controlled this exact point on the map controlled the trade and military routes connecting entire continents. For over 4,000 years, armies representing nearly every major regional power in antiquity fought for control of this hill, leaving behind a layered archive of destruction so dense it functions almost as a physical timeline of ancient warfare itself. Among the structures uncovered here are massive fortified gateways matching descriptions of major military construction projects attributed to a specific historical king, along with enormous stable complexes capable of housing hundreds of war horses, confirming the site's role as a serious military stronghold rather than a minor outpost. Beneath the surface, archaeologists discovered an extraordinary engineering achievement, a deep vertical shaft connected to a long tunnel cut directly through bedrock, allowing residents to access a hidden water source entirely outside the city's defensive walls without exposing that vulnerability to a watching enemy. According to ancient accounts, this exact location was also the site of a pivotal and tragic royal death, a respected king of Judah killed in confrontation with an invading Egyptian pharaoh. For years, no direct archaeological evidence connected to that specific event existed until, remarkably, in early 2025, researchers excavating the site uncovered an unusually massive quantity of 7th century Egyptian and Greek pottery, far exceeding anything previously found anywhere else in the region from that exact period. This discovery strongly indicates a substantial, sustained Egyptian military presence at precisely the time and place the ancient account describes, the first physical evidence directly supporting that specific historical episode ever recovered. It does not conclusively prove every detail of the original narrative, and researchers themselves have been careful to describe it as supporting evidence rather than absolute confirmation, but its timing, location, and scale align with an unsettling level of precision. So now the journey ends exactly where it began, with a question rather than a conclusion. 14 places, scattered across thousands of years and thousands of miles, each one supposedly buried by skeptics as myth, exaggeration, or convenient fiction, and each one eventually dragged back into physical, measurable reality by people who were not even trying to prove anything religious, simply trying to understand what actually happened on this land. Some of these discoveries hold up under brutal scientific scrutiny even years later. Others, like the celebrated meteor explanation for Sodom and Gomorrah, collapse the moment independent experts are given enough time to check the math, a reminder that even the most viral, most satisfying explanation can turn out to be wrong, and that genuine truth-seeking sometimes means accepting an uncomfortable retraction rather than clinging to a comfortable headline. The treasure described on that copper scroll is still out there somewhere. Unclaimed for nearly 2,000 years, the Ark of the Covenant is still missing. Its disappearance still unexplained by any historical record we currently possess. The Christian communities guarding some of humanity's oldest sacred sites are disappearing in real time, year after year, largely outside global attention. And the rivers and seas that anchor so much of this ancient story, the Jordan, the Dead Sea, are both dying simultaneously, their slow collapse unfolding in our own lifetime rather than in some distant historical past. Every one of these places still exists. Every one of them is still being studied, still being argued over, still capable of producing a discovery next year that rewrites everything we think we currently understand. The only honest question left to ask is the one nobody can yet answer. What happens the day someone finally finds what that copper scroll was describing all along, and what else, buried right now under sand, salt, or seawater, is still waiting for its own accidental shepherd to throw the right stone into the right cave?